overflowing with noise, shallow takes, and information that evaporates the moment you hear it, Soleneus Media exists for one purpose: to give you depth. Whether the subject is philosophy, psychology, history, science, artificial intelligence, literature, or the shape of the future, every series we publish is built on one idea: that thinking clearly is a form of survival. If you enjoy this program, explore the rest of our library. Every show is designed to stand alone, but together they form a larger project, a guided tour of the forces, intellectual, emotional, political, technological, that built the world we live in and the world we're about to enter. On a bright November morning in 1963, the motorcade moved slowly through downtown Dallas. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the crowds thick along the sidewalks. People leaned out of office windows, waved small flags, and craned for a glimpse of the young president whose face they knew from television. In the open limousine, John Fitzgerald Kennedy sat beside his wife, Jacqueline, her pink suit vivid against the black car. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife were in the front seat. The mood was festive. The trip was meant to mend political fences, to show unity in a state where factions of the Democratic Party were tearing at each other. The president smiled, waved, turned toward one cluster of onlookers and then another. A few minutes later, as the car rolled past the Texas School Book Depository, gunshots cracked through the warm air. Kennedy slumped. The motorcade surged toward Parkland Hospital. Before the hour was out, the man who had promised a new frontier and asked Americans to ask what they could do for their country was dead at 46. The assassination in Dallas has become the defining image of John F. Kennedy's presidency, a moment of trauma replayed in endless loops of film and memory. Yet his story and his impact on the American presidency cannot be reduced to those seconds in Dealey Plaza. He was a child of privilege, a sickly boy in a powerful family who grew into a war hero, a congressman and senator whose early record was cautious rather than radical, a candidate who shattered the barrier against Catholic presidents, a leader who inspired a generation with words and style while also making grave mistakes in foreign policy, and a figure whose early death froze him in a kind of permanent youth, leaving historians to argue endlessly over what might have been. John F. Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, into a clan as ambitious as any in American life. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was a wealthy businessman and political operator. The son of Irish immigrants who had risen from the world of Boston's ward politics to become a banker, movie executive, and sometime diplomat. His mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, was the daughter of Boston's legendary mayor, John "Honey" Fitzgerald. The family combined money, Catholicism, and a fierce sense of ethnic pride. Joe Kennedy hammered into his 9 children the idea that they were destined not just for success, but for power. Jack, as John was called, was the second son. His older brother, Joseph Jr., was the one his father groomed most aggressively for high office. The future president, perhaps, or at least the one who would blaze the trail. Jack, by contrast, was physically fragile. Throughout his childhood and youth, he suffered from a string of illnesses: scarlet fever, gastrointestinal problems, mysterious back pains that sent him in and out of hospitals. He grew up in the shadow of his stronger, more straightforward brother, but he compensated with wit and curiosity. He loved history and biography, reading about Churchill, Lincoln, and the great battles of Europe. At Choate, the elite boarding school he attended, he cultivated a kind of rakish charm, forming a group of pranksters who called themselves the Muckers. Yet underneath the jokes, there was an acute awareness of politics and strategy. The Kennedy household oscillated between New England and more glamorous settings: Palm Beach, London, the French Riviera. When Joe Kennedy was appointed U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James's in 1938, the family moved to England. Jack watched the gathering storm of European fascism from close range. He traveled on the continent, observed the British attempt to appease Hitler at Munich, and listened as his father, more pessimistic about Britain's chances than most, argued that America should avoid being dragged into another European war. Jack absorbed both his father's skepticism about old elites and the larger lesson that history could pivot quickly, catching cautious men unprepared. Returning to the United States, he enrolled at Harvard. There he was not an outstanding student in all subjects, but in history and government he shone. His senior thesis examined why Britain had been so slow to rearm in the face of Nazi aggression. Revised and published as a book called Why England Slept, it revealed a young man thinking seriously about the responsibilities of great powers and the dangers of complacency. It also benefited from his father's connections, receiving publicity unusual for a student work. Already, the Kennedy machinery was gently nudging Jack into the public eye. World War II dragged him from theory into action. In 1941, he joined the U.S. Navy. His chronic health problems might have kept him out, but Joe Kennedy's influence and Jack's determination helped secure him a commission. After training, he was assigned to command a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, in the South Pacific. In August 1943, during a night mission in the Solomon Islands, a Japanese destroyer sliced PT-109 in two, killing 2 of his crew and leaving the survivors clinging to debris in dark waters. What followed became part of Kennedy legend. Jack, his back already damaged, towed a badly burned crewman by holding the strap of the man's life vest in his teeth as he swam several miles to a small island. For days, he led his men from one tiny, uninhabited island to another, searching for help. Eventually, with the assistance of local islanders and a message carved on a coconut husk, they were rescued. The coconut would later sit on his desk in the Oval Office, encased in glass, a token of the narrow line between survival and death. The Navy awarded Kennedy the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism, and newspapers back home carried the story. Joe Kennedy saw in it not only a source of paternal pride, but a political asset. When the war ended and Joe Jr. was killed in a disastrous bomber mission in 1944, the father's hopes shifted to Jack. The son who had once seemed the less likely politician became the designated standard-bearer. In 1946, Jack Kennedy ran for Congress from a Boston-area district. The campaign was a family operation. Siblings and friends knocking on doors, Rose distributing campaign materials in Catholic neighborhoods. Joe spending freely on advertising and organization. Jack's style on the stump was somewhat shy, but his war record, famous family name, and tireless retail politicking carried the day. He won easily. He was just 29. As a member of the House of Representatives, Kennedy was not especially prominent. He served 3 terms, generally supporting the policies of President Harry Truman, including the Marshall Plan and the early stages of the Cold War. His positions reflected the worldview of his class and generation: staunchly anti-communist, wary of isolationism, supportive of a strong national defense. Yet, he was also careful. He did not attach himself to controversial domestic causes. He learned how Washington worked, built relationships, and kept an eye on the next rung. In 1952, he challenged Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., scion of one of Massachusetts' oldest political dynasties. The campaign pitted Brahmin republicanism against Irish Catholic ambition. Kennedy's team, led in part by his kid sister Eunice and his force of nature younger brother Robert, outworked and outmaneuvered Lodge. They mobilized labor, Catholics, and working-class neighborhoods. Kennedy won, riding a Democratic tide that contrasted with Dwight Eisenhower's national victory at the presidential level. At 35, he entered the Senate. His Senate years were a mixture of real legislative work and careful positioning. He took particular interest in foreign affairs, serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and traveling widely. His health, however, was worse than most people knew. He suffered from Addison's disease, a serious endocrine disorder, as well as chronic back problems that required multiple surgeries. On more than one occasion, he was close to death. Yet the public saw only the tan, fit young senator, sailing off Hyannis Port, joking on camera, exuding vitality. The contrast between image and reality would become a defining feature of the Kennedy persona. In 1953, he married Jacqueline Bouvier, a sophisticated, French-speaking photographer and writer. Jackie brought an aura of style and cosmopolitan grace to his life, as well as a sharp, ironic intellect that few outsiders glimpsed. Their marriage was complicated. Kennedy's serial infidelities are now well documented, but as a public partnership, it was remarkably effective. Together, they projected a glamour that set them apart from the older political generation. Kennedy's literary side produced another book, Profiles in Courage, a study of senators who had taken unpopular stands on principle. Published in 1956, it won a Pulitzer Prize, though ghostwriting and the help of his staff, especially Theodore Sorensen, played a large role. Regardless of the book's exact authorship, it reinforced an image of Kennedy as thoughtful, historically minded, someone who thought about moral courage in public life. By the late 1950s, he was clearly eyeing the presidency. The 1956 Democratic Convention flirted with making him the vice presidential nominee, but the ticket went to Adlai Stevenson and Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. The near miss actually helped Kennedy. He gained national exposure without being tied to a losing campaign. Over the next 4 years, he traveled incessantly, building relationships with party leaders, speaking to local organizations, and testing how his Catholicism would play in Protestant America. Religion was the most obvious obstacle. No Catholic had ever been elected president. Many Protestants feared, openly or privately, that a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope. Kennedy and his team knew they had to confront the issue directly. In September 1960, during the general election campaign, he gave a speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, declaring that he believed in an America where the separation of church and state was absolute, when no prelate would tell him how to act as president, and no minister would tell his parishioners how to vote. He insisted he was the Democratic candidate who happened to be Catholic, not the Catholic candidate. The speech did not erase prejudice, but it reassured enough voters to dull the issue. The 1960 election pitted Kennedy against Vice President Richard Nixon, a seasoned politician with deep experience in domestic and foreign affairs. The race was razor thin. The two men debated on television in the first ever televised presidential debates. Kennedy's performance there became legendary. Calm, tanned, and composed, he looked more at ease on camera than Nixon, who appeared pale and sweaty under the hot lights. Millions of viewers felt, often unconsciously, that the younger man seemed more presidential. The debates helped narrow the gap and gave Kennedy momentum. The election itself was extraordinarily close. Kennedy won the popular vote by a fraction of a percentage point and carried the Electoral College with a slim but clear margin. Allegations of voter fraud in places like Illinois and Texas circulated, but Nixon chose not to challenge the outcome, calculating that a protracted dispute would damage the country. In January 1961, the 43-year-old senator from Massachusetts became the youngest elected president in American history. His inaugural address on January 20th, 1961, remains one of the most quoted speeches in American politics. Standing bareheaded in the cold, his breath visible in the air, he spoke of a new generation of Americans born in the 20th century, tested by war, tempered by a long, hard peace. He pledged to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty. Phrases that captured both the soaring idealism and the potential overreach of his foreign policy stance. Then came the line that would echo longest: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." For a nation emerging from the complacent prosperity of the 1950s, those words felt like a summons. Kennedy's domestic agenda, the New Frontier, aimed to tackle poverty, racial injustice, and economic stagnation through a combination of tax reforms, federal programs, and investment in education and space exploration. His success, however, was limited by a conservative coalition in Congress made up of Republicans and Southern Democrats. Many of his proposals stalled or were watered down. He did win passage of measures like the Area Redevelopment Act and the expansion of unemployment benefits. But the transformational domestic legislation associated with his name would largely come later under Lyndon Johnson, who pushed through the Civil Rights Act and Great Society programs using Kennedy's memory as a moral lever. Where Kennedy's presidency moved fastest, for better and worse, was in foreign policy. The Cold War colorized almost every decision. Just 3 months after taking office, he faced the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Inherited from the Eisenhower administration but approved by Kennedy, the operation involved a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles landing on Cuba's southern coast to spark an uprising against Fidel Castro. Kennedy, wary of open U.S. involvement, refused to provide the full air support the exiles expected. The invasion collapsed almost immediately. Many of the exiles were killed or captured. Castro's position was strengthened. The Soviet Union's confidence in Kennedy's judgment sank. The young president took personal responsibility, telling reporters that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. But the humiliation was real and dangerous. The following year brought an even more dangerous confrontation: the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, American reconnaissance photographs revealed that the Soviet Union was installing medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, capable of striking much of the United States with little warning. For 13 days, Kennedy and his advisors wrestled with options: airstrikes, invasion, diplomatic pressure, or some mixture. Military chiefs pressed for immediate bombing. Kennedy, remembering the surprise of Pearl Harbor and wary of triggering a nuclear war, chose a blockade, euphemized as a quarantine, and a combination of intense back-channel diplomacy and public firmness. The world watched as American ships confronted Soviet vessels near Cuba, and both sides raised their nuclear alert levels. In the end, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in return for a public American promise not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove obsolete U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without war, but both leaders emerged chastened. Kennedy, in particular, came to see nuclear weapons as a danger not just to his enemies, but to civilization itself. The experience pushed him toward a more cautious, cooperative posture with Moscow. In 1963, he delivered a speech at American University calling for a rethinking of U.S.-Soviet relations, emphasizing shared humanity over ideological hostility. That same year, he signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which ended atmospheric nuclear tests by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, the contours of another conflict were taking shape in Southeast Asia. Kennedy inherited a growing American commitment to South Vietnam, framed as a bulwark against communism in the region. He increased the number of American advisors and covert support, but stopped short of large-scale combat deployment. His administration supported, then tolerated, then became complicit in the overthrow of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963, a coup that plunged the country into deeper instability. Whether Kennedy, had he lived, would have escalated a war the way Lyndon Johnson later did, remains one of the great what-ifs of American history. What is clear is that the United States under Kennedy took decisive steps down the path that would lead to Vietnam. At home, the racial order of the United States was cracking under pressure from black activists and their allies. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration campaigns in the South confronted Jim Crow laws head-on. Kennedy came into office cautious on civil rights, wary of alienating Southern Democrats whose support he needed in Congress. But events pushed him forward. Images of police dogs and fire hoses turned on peaceful demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, horrified the nation and the world. In June 1963, Kennedy gave a televised address framing civil rights not as a regional problem, but as a moral issue. "This is not a sectional issue," he said. "It is not a partisan issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution." He proposed what would become the Civil Rights Act, though it would be left to Johnson to shepherd it through Congress after Kennedy's death. In August 1963, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Washington for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Kennedy watched from the White House, aware that the movement had grown beyond the control of any administration, but also recognizing that the moral tide was shifting. His presidency had become one of the hinge points between the old order of segregation and the new, still unfinished era of civil rights. Another arena where Kennedy's vision left a lasting imprint was space. In 1961, he challenged the nation to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. The goal was strategic, showing technological and ideological superiority over the Soviet Union, and imaginative, tapping into the romance of exploration. The Apollo program that followed consumed vast sums of money and energy, but it also inspired millions. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, it was in fulfillment of a pledge Kennedy had made 8 years earlier. For all his policy initiatives, much of Kennedy's influence lay in his style and the way he reshaped the image of the presidency. He was the first modern president to fully inhabit the television age. Press conferences became performances in which he displayed quick wit, self-deprecating humor, and an ability to parry hostile questions without seeming angry. The White House, under the Kennedys, was cast as a place of culture. Poets, artists, and intellectuals were invited to dinners. Pablo Casals played cello there. Jackie oversaw a restoration that emphasized historical furnishings and American art. Commentators spoke of Camelot, borrowing a line from a musical Jackie referenced after his death, to evoke a brief, shining moment of grace and possibility. Behind the carefully curated images, however, were shadows, intense pressure, hidden illnesses, risky personal behavior. Kennedy relied on a daily regimen of medications from Dr. Max Jacobson, sometimes called Dr. Feelgood, whose injections may have contained amphetamines and other substances. He engaged in affairs with a series of women, behavior that would likely be politically fatal in the modern era, but was largely shielded from the public then by a deferential press culture. The contrast between public rectitude and private risk-taking complicates any simple picture of his character. All of these strands, promise and peril, idealism and secrecy, collided with brutal suddenness in Dallas. That day, November 22nd, 1963, began as a routine political trip. The president's motorcade route had been published. Security, by modern standards, was remarkably loose. Open cars, no bulletproof glass, little effort to control windows along the route. When shots rang out, the protection systems in place were simply not designed to respond. Within hours, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One as the new president, Jackie standing beside him in her blood-stained suit. The transition was constitutionally smooth and emotionally wrenching. In the years that followed, investigations and conspiracy theories proliferated. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, fired the shots that killed Kennedy. Others found the story unsatisfying and pointed to possible plots involving the mafia, the CIA, Castro, anti-Castro exiles, or some combination. For many Americans, the sense that something had gone wrong, not just in Dallas, but in the country's own narrative, never entirely faded. Kennedy's death became a symbolic end to a more innocent, hopeful chapter of post-war America. What remains, then, of John F. Kennedy's presidency when we strip away the myths and the mournful music? On one level, his practical accomplishments were limited by time and politics. He served less than 3 years. Many of the landmark laws associated with his era, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, major anti-poverty programs, were enacted under Johnson. The Bay of Pigs was a disaster of his own making. Vietnam's quagmire deepened under policies he endorsed. And yet he steered the country through the most dangerous nuclear confrontation in history without sliding into war, began the first serious steps toward arms control, and articulated a vision of public service that still echoes. For podcast listeners, moving through the list of presidents, Kennedy stands as both product and shaper of his time, Cold War warrior and cautious peacemaker, child of privilege speaking to an egalitarian ideal, symbol of youthful energy whose tenure was startlingly brief. Much of his power over the American imagination lies precisely in that brevity. We do not have to reckon with an old, tired Kennedy mired in scandal or failure. We have the images, the inaugural snow, the moon speech, the Berlin Wall address, Ich bin ein Berliner. And then the open car in Dallas. The story stops mid-sentence. In that unfinished quality lies both danger and opportunity. Danger, because it is tempting to project onto Kennedy whatever we wish had happened, turning him into a blank screen for longing. Opportunity, because his words about citizenship, courage, and shared responsibility still challenge us. He told Americans that they had a role to play beyond consuming and complaining, that the fate of the country and the wider world depended on their willingness to act. Whether or not we agree with every policy he pursued, that call remains potent. F. Kennedy's life traced an arc from Brookline nurseries to Pacific Islands, from smoky wardrooms to television studios, from the high rhetoric of the new frontier to the brutal shock of assassination. He was not a saint, nor a mere PR construct. He was a complex, flawed, unusually gifted man thrown into the center of mid-20th century storms. He left behind a legacy that is part record, part myth, and part unanswered question. What else might he have done, and how might the country have been different had the motorcade not turned down Elm Street that day in Dallas?
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be.